Going back in time and seeing the proofs and the puzzles discovered, they can pretty much enlighten you and strengthen you in the truth, or give you the whole truth. Here is what the early church tells us about sons and daughters together in the ministry of the Church of Christ in the very first centuries of Christianity. No matter how one thinks or sees these images, it surely scratches the surface of some of the ways of the Church that we have nowadays. A stone sarcophagus front from the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, which dates from around AD 430, shows a male and a female figure standing on each side of the altar, holding their arms up in the orange pose. This is an ivory pyx, around 500 AD, a 6th century ivory pyx of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. The belief is that the images are significant because they show women and men in parallel roles, their bodies and gestures mirroring one another, and the researcher behind this investigation suggests that this parallelism is indicative of their equality in their liturgical roles. One of the artifacts the researcher bases her findings on is the ivory reliquary box dating from around AD 430 that depicts a man and a woman standing on either side of an altar, each raising a chalice. The altar is that of the old St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. The gesture of raising a chalice is recognized as a liturgical act performed by priests. Two other artifacts also depict women at altars are the images shown before. Macy, author of The Hidden History of Women's Ordination, Female Clergy in the Medieval West, acknowledges that the 5th century ivory reliquary box depicting a female figure lifting a chalice could suggest priesthood. It is a possibility, he said, but there are other Christian artifacts that depict a woman lifting a chalice. The two women seen carrying censers of incense at the altar in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem is clearly consistent with the role of diacons, said Catacombs, the researcher. A mosaic in the chapel of Bishop Zeno in Verona depicts the Lamb of God and, below, 4 women. They are, from your right to left, Saint Praxede, from the 2nd century, Mary, the sister of Praxede, Pudentian, and a person still alive at the time, surrounded by a square aureole. Her name is Theodora, and could be the mother of Pope Paschal I. Above her head is the Greek word episkopa, the feminine form of bishop. Some have claimed that this title was only honorary. The feminine ending of her name has also been concealed. In Rome, Catacombs, the researcher, led a group to see the apice of the central dome of a mosaic at St. Venantius Chapel in the Lateran Baptistery, which depicts Mary wearing what appears to be a pallium, a symbol of episcopal authority given to new bishops. Mary between the Apostle Paul on her left and the Apostle Peter on her right, with Jesus above all. In this mosaic, we can see Mary raising her arms in the pose of praying, lift up holy hands. 1 Timothy 2 verse 8. According to Miriam Dugnan of the Weingarts Institute of the Catholic Research, who was part of the group, the Holy Office decreed in the 1916 that all images depicting Mary in the priestly vestments were to be banned, and this mosaic was obscured by a massive altarpiece. Most of the documented red tesserae comprising the cross on Mary's pallium were removed. The mosaic shows Mary's arms raised as if performing the Eucharist. The episcopal pallium was not seen on anyone in art until 550. This is 650. It is only ever given to someone considered a bishop. Pope Theodore commissioned this mosaic, including the bishop's pallium. It is a symbolic way of saying Mary was a church leader. Some experts believe that women depicted with a pallium were abbesses. However, Katets refers to Russian art historian Alexei Lidov's research. He believes this 7th century mosaic of Mary with the pallium is a symbol of her priesthood, comparing it with an 11th century wall painting in Old St. Clement's Basilica in Rome that depicts Pope Clement with his arms raised wearing the same pallium while performing the Eucharist at the altar table. Here is the Orthodox Church art of Mary holding this piece of clothing similar to the crosses of the pallium. Mary raises her arms in the pose of the orange in the Vatican Museum. The white maniple at her waist indicates clerical rank. Surrounded by saints, she seems to be exhortating the two women below her. These last two were probably benefactors for the Church. Newly restored Italian frescoes, dating back to between 230 to 240 AD, are housed inside the Catacombs of Priscilla of Rome and were unveiled by the Vatican. It has revealed what could have been women priests in the early Christian Church. Dug out from the 2nd to 5th centuries, the Catacombs of Priscilla are a complex labyrinth of underground burial chambers stretching 8 miles beneath the northern half of the city. The marble sarcophagus they found inside had been broken into hundreds of pieces, wrote Rodolfo Lanciani, the scholar in charge of the dig. Lavish mosaics, a rare find in Rome's catacombs, had been pulled from the walls. The marble incrustations torn off, the altar dismantled, the bones dispersed. Some of the plundering, it turned out, had been carried out 2 centuries earlier and on the Vatican's orders. In the mid-17th century, both Pope Innocent X and Clement IX sent treasure hunters deep into the catacombs' depths. Others may have destroyed the catacombs for a reason other than greed. The discoveries there have sparked controversy over the roles of women in the Church and helped scholars re-evaluate the importance of the Virgin Mary in the early Christian history. In a room called the Cubiculum of the Veiled Woman, shows a woman whose arms are outstretched like those of a priest saying Mass. She wears what the Catacombs Italian website calls a rich liturgical garment. She also wears what appears to be a stole, a vestment worn by priests. This piece is located in the Greek chapel portion of the crypt, and it depicts 7 figures breaking bread together at a table. For nearly 100 years, scholars believed it was 6 men and a woman. However, as scholars studied it further, new insights emerged, leading to the conclusion that all the figures are actually women, and a woman is fulfilling the role of priest, serving the Eucharist. Indeed, the fresco shows 7 individuals along the dining bench. The figure on the far left-hand side breaks bread. At the time of the fresco's discovery, the assumption was that if that figure is breaking bread, then he has to be male, because a woman wouldn't break bread and be leading the Eucharist, says Nicola Denzey-Lewis, professor of religious studies. Perhaps to aid that interpretation, in the 9th century, someone rubbed off some of the face's pigments, making it look shadowed, as if it has a beard. Yet, thanks to the figure's dress, one figure in the middle even wears a veil, as a Roman woman would, and their delicate figures, few academics today, or even visitors, think the figures are male. But Fabrizio Visconti, the superintendent of the Vatican's Sacred Archaeology Commission, said such a reading of the frescoes was pure fable, a legend, even though the Catacombs official guide says there is a clear reference to the banquet of the Holy Eucharist in the fresco. Visconti said the scene of the banquet wasn't a Eucharistic banquet, but a funeral banquet. Yet, says Denzey and other scholars, whether women led Mass or not may be besides the point. The frescoes in Santa Priscilla show that a woman played a larger role in the early church than is generally assumed. Capella Greca, or Greek chapel, an extraordinary number of frescoes, many that, and usually, future women. The Vatican has restricted the priesthood for men, arguing that Jesus chose only men as his apostles. The Bible shows the important place of women in the early church. The women were the first to go to the empty tomb and proclaim the resurrection. Some championed the gospel with Paul, taught new converts, prophesied, gathered churches into their homes. served the Church, transmitted the epistles of Paul, and were considered outstanding among the apostles. Lesser-known visual evidence of the presence of women in ministry can also be found in the ancient churches in Italy. From the time of the First Council of Nicaea until the 12th century, Christians created depictions of women preaching, of women appointed as clergy, and even one carrying a chalice of communion, by which believers always remember the words of Christ, "This is my blood, the blood of the covenant, which is shed for many for the forgiveness of sins." The 9th century mosaic detail from the apse of the Basilica of San Prassede in Rome shows a female saint alongside Saint Paul with his arm around her. In the Basilica of Santa Pollinaria Nuovo, 22 female martyrs, placed just below the apostles, are led by the Magi to Mary and the newborn Christ. Each is identified by name and honored for giving their life to Jesus. The Byzantine Empress Theodora wears a golden chalice. Facing her, on the opposite side of the altar in the Basilica of San Vitale, her husband, Emperor Justinian, carries a loaf of bread. Bread and wine are the two elements of the Eucharist. The most obvious interpretation of these artifacts is that the women held liturgical roles in the early church, Macy said. For centuries it was presumed that women did not lead the liturgy or perform certain liturgical functions in Christianity. That presumption is no longer held, so one looks at the remains of the past without that presumption. Much has truly been removed that we have no idea about, that has been true and firm in the early church foundations. As it was in times back, so may it be today.